everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner.
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution.
We've overtaxed people.
People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here.
1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. I'm Jeremy Munson, a state representative from southern Minnesota, and I am broadcasting right below the House chamber in the Minnesota Capitol in the last hours of the special session of 2021. And with me again is Walter Hudson. Walter, introduce yourself.
I'm a city council member in Albertville, a former commentator, associate editor of Newsreel blog, David Horowitz publication, and PJ Media contributor. And I also had a talk show on Twin Cities News Talk for 3 years, and really excited to find out what's going on down there in St. Paul, which is strange to hear coming out of my own mouth.
That's right. Well, first I wanted to make kind of poke fun of this hat that showed up on my desk on the House floor. There's an activist in Minnesota that's handing out kind of their first annual awards to Legislator extraordinaire, which kind of makes it a hat that I can only wear here on the show and around the house in front of my kids. But he hands them out for people that introduce bold legislation. And he gave me this one because I introduced the bill that allows counties to secede and started a pretty interesting conversation in Minnesota. So for that, he gave me the award.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I'll take that off. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is an amendment that we're going to be offering here momentarily on the House floor. We've been debating omnibus bills, and we have passed now every single budget bill off the House floor except for the tax bill, which is the last one. And the tax bill is the bill that Republicans want most because it has significant tax cuts, conformity for PPP loans and such. It's also the bill that Democrats hold on to kind of the trust but verify. They want the E through 12 education bill and the state government finance bill to pass. And so this is the kind of the trade-off on both chambers. And so we've held on to the tax bill that Democrats have here, and we're about to finish debating that one. And we're about 5 hours from the end of the budget year. That's how close we are to the finish line of the government shutting down. So we're going to be offering an amendment tonight on lobbying transparency. The amendment, which nobody knows about yet, is the amendment that would actually prohibit legislators from working for lobbying firms. And over the past few decades, there have been several legislators that have, legislature's a part-time job. So it pays, $30,000 to $40,000 a year and doesn't usually pay enough to support a family. And so many people take other work, whether they're real estate agents, insurance agents, or what such. But, you get to know the process and how things work here in St. Paul. And a lot of legislators are attracted to the idea of working for public advocacy groups. And they take a job working for a company whose purpose it is to lobby the legislature to get some of the handouts and the pork that gets tucked into so many of these bills. And it's a disgusting behavior. And of course, we have several legislators that work for groups like this. And so working on legislation that actually holds us accountable to the taxpayers and to the voters is really difficult for some reason. And so many legislators have said, no, we don't want to hear that bill. I've carried this legislation for 3 years and have not even had a hearing on it, even though privately legislators tell us it's something that we should do. And so we've been working with more and more legislators on it. And they said, you know what, if we want to get this through, it impacts no one outside the legislature. So we just need to get this done. And we're working on a agreement to get this added to the tax bill at the last minute. And we're going to do a roll call vote and make sure everybody's on the record on this amendment.
Fantastic. Sounds awesome. And I'm really fascinated to see how it's going to play out. So how confident are you that you're going to be able to get a roll call vote on this?
Well, we've been working on this for weeks with the Senate, with the leadership in the House. and but we have to keep it buttoned up because if people start leaking this, then all of a sudden the few legislators that this does impact will all of a sudden start lashing out. And of course, you and I both know that Kurt Dowd is one of those legislators. He took a job working for Stateside Associates over 2 years ago. And so, he's going to get defensive about this. And we don't want to have a Republican leader start trading away conservative values in order to tank this amendment. Because it's a very, information like this at the Capitol is very powerful. And if it gives him the ability to say, you know what, Melissa Hortman, I will give up tax cuts in order to get this, buried. We don't want to do that. We don't want to sell out Republican values. So we've been just negotiating this as a way to, it's something that everybody agrees needs to happen. And we're going to get this through.
So you think the amendment's going to be successful?
Yes. I mean, we wouldn't do this if it wasn't going to be successful. I mean, it'd be nice to get everybody on the record. And I think it has about a 90% chance of passing right now. I think we've been working on, working on the powers that be, making sure the language is really good. I think that there's so many people here. There's probably 30 legislators that work for nonprofits that advocate for legislation. But, if you sit on a board of a homeless shelter, I know that you're going to be advocating for homeless because it's one of your main issues you're in St. Paul for. Okay.
Right.
There's also members that sit on boards of, pro-legalization of marijuana. I know where they stand.
Right.
But if you work for a lobbying firm that takes on hundreds and hundreds of clients, I don't know where your allegiance lies. If you work for, if you represent pharmaceutical companies or whatever else. So I think it's important to make sure that the clients are disclosed and make sure that information is public.
Yeah, no, obviously the underlying principle of what you're trying to accomplish is beyond contest. I mean, you can't argue that there's some sort of legitimate legislative interest or government interest in having representatives who are actively getting paid to advocate for public policy. I mean, that's a pretty clear conflict of interest. Some might characterize it as bribery. It is what it is. It's not good. It's not a good part of our process. It doesn't contribute to the quality of public deliberation. And so I think the goal is certainly laudable. It's fascinating to me to contemplate that this amendment could end up getting attached. So this is an omnibus bill that it gets attached to. So how does that interact with your fundamental opposition to omnibus bills? Do you end up voting for the tax omnibus bill in order to get this amendment through, or do you still vote against the tax omnibus bill?
Yeah, whenever you're trying to get something attached to an omnibus bill, that's always one of the asks. Well, we could add it to this bill, but you're going to vote for the omnibus bill, aren't you? None of us in the Newhouse Caucus are willing to fold on that principle. So, some of us will vote for omnibus bills, but I don't. Cal Barr usually doesn't, and so we're not going to vote. I'm not going to vote for this bill just because of that. I'm voting no on every single omnibus bill during the special session, every budget bill, because I believe they're unconstitutional. But I have to work on getting legislation into law, and as much as I try to get individual single subject bills through, sometimes I have to offer amendments to get them attached to an omnibus bill. So that's, that unfortunately, that's how the process works. But as we continue to advocate for single subject bills, we have to work within the system that we have now. Now, the omnibus tax bill actually isn't that bad of a bill. There's significant tax cuts. There's been a few bills like that. Even public safety was a pretty good bill. The ag bill was a pretty good bill. And the ag bill was actually pretty small and very single subject or close to single subject. But the omnibus tax bill, it has a bunch of crap attached to it. Like the Rondo project we discussed earlier, that bridge over Highway 94, they want to basically enclose the thing and make it into a tunnel and build buildings over it. It's the big bridge to nowhere. It's like a multi-billion-dollar project. There's $7 million to design the Rondo Bridge in the tax bill. So it's part of the end of session negotiation. So certainly a multi-subject omnibus bill.
So you're saying that you think there's a 90% chance this amendment gets attached. Similar chance to the tax omnibus bill passing. I mean, usually these things do. So assuming both of those things happen, what do you see? What do you foresee at this moment? I mean, granted, by the time people hear this, it's probably going to be news that they're already aware of. But so they'll be able to see whether or not how accurate your prediction is here. But what do you see as the immediate political fallout in terms of specifically Kurt Doubt and the other legislators who this is going to directly affect?
Well, part of the negotiating the language on the bill to make sure that it's constitutional and accurate is to put an appropriate effective date on the bill. So the effective date isn't until the end of this legislative. You would, if you were one of these people that it impacted, you could continue to be a legislator through the end of your term, and so it wouldn't go into effect until next term.
Right.
So that was part of the negotiation. It'd be nice to have it immediate, but we just want to make sure that we're doing this correctly and fairly, giving people proper notice. So I think that some people might see this as an attack on certain individuals, but throughout history on both sides of the aisle, there's been people that have been violating the trust of their constituents in this manner and creating these conflict of interest that need to be sorted out. And so I think it's something that is appropriate and things that you need to do here at the legislature to kind of restore some integrity and transparency and honesty in government.
How do you think? I'm getting a little catty here, but how do you foresee the rhetorical response from Kurt Doubt playing out? Like, do you? Because if I try to war game it, what would make good political sense for him to do would be to kind of just roll with it, because it's not like there's anything he could do about it once it passes. It is what it is. He's going to have to adjust. And if he tries to make a big deal out of it or tries to come back at you in some way or other supporters, then it just makes him look pretty terrible, I would have to think. So do you think he just kind of keeps his mouth shut and takes the punch? Or will he not be able to help himself and spout off something in response?
Well, that'll be the interesting thing. I mean, I don't want to. I've run different scenarios through. If it becomes personal, if he just ignores it, if he doesn't vote on it, does vote on it. There's a lot of different scenarios that can play out. So, in the next episode, we'll recap what happens.
Sure.
But I think this is, things that we're working on now that I think are really important
Sure.
things that are. I've carried this bill for 3 years, so I think it's an important bill. And the end of session, it's nice to be involved in some of the negotiations at the end of session, and so that's good, especially being in the minority.
Speaking to your principle against voting for omnibus bills and your observation of trying to work within the system as it currently exists and just the political strategy of this, I think you're tiptoeing that balance, that wire, you're walking that wire pretty successfully, because this doesn't require you to do something that you said you weren't going to do. It's you recognizing that the system works the way it works, and so you're trying to get something accomplished. You try to do this kind of legislative jujitsu, where you take your opponent's energy. They're all going to vote for this omnibus bill because that's what they do. And so use that energy to accomplish something good, accomplish something positive that you haven't otherwise been able to get done. It's pretty artful, I think.
Yeah, another thing that's a hurdle that I have is because I'm in the minority, for one, and also, I'm in the minority of the minority. We're in the new House caucus, so we only have 4 members. One of the things, in order to get a roll call vote on the floor, you need to have 15 hands. You need to have 15 people raise their hand in order to say, yes, we should have this vote on the record so that our constituents know how we vote. In a lot of states, it's not like that. Most states are 2 people that are needed in order to get a roll call. Some states are even 1, but 15 are in Minnesota. So in a caucus of 4, getting 15 hands can be difficult. So one of the things I wanted to offer on the state government finance bill yesterday was an amendment. First of all, it's important to know Gazelka sent over an amendment to that bill that ended the peacetime emergency and then also refunded most of the fees that businesses were fined if they violated the executive orders, and it restored licenses, reinstated licenses that were taken from people. If bars were serving people or didn't follow the mask mandate, and they didn't heed to the warnings from the governor or the attorney general, their liquor license was suspended for sometimes 4 or 5 years. Their
Right.
food handling license was taken by the Department of Health. And so these licenses were reinstated. I think it's a very important amendment. When that bill, the state government finance bill, came over to the House, it went to the Ways and Means Committee, and then Democrats struck that language from the bill. They left the peacetime emergency, but they took away the licensing and the fines, it was just a terrible takeaway from people, kind of kicking people when they're down. So I wanted to offer a language to restore that. And for some reason, Gazelka's refunding of fines was only above $1,000. So I refunded every single penny. I wrote an amendment to refund every single penny. And then I wanted a separate amendment to reinstate the licenses. So it would be 2 separate votes. But knowing that, that Kurt Dowd keeps on denying his hands on votes to just be, petty, I offered these amendments to Eric Lucero and asked him to offer them and ask for roll call votes. And he did on both. So we got roll call votes on everything. So I don't need credit for these amendments. They were really good amendments, and they were also political amendments. So you introduce them, you get roll call votes so that you can go and campaign against one of the Democrats who had 4 bars shut down in his district.
Right.
And say, hey, your legislator voted against restoring your licenses, right? We've had bar owners, Lisa in Lakeville had to sell the alibi because she lost her liquor license and her food handling license. And the city won't even let the new owner reinstate the licenses until they change the name. That's how petty they're becoming. So it was important to go back and try to restore this, get them on the record of how they vote. And they were great amendments. And I'm glad that Eric Lucero offered them. And, we had a good debate on the House floor. And the nice thing about the last 2 days of session, the House has suspended the 24-hour rule. So you don't have to file these amendments an entire day in advance. You can just walk them up and drop them onto the chief clerks and say, Munson introduces an amendment or Lucero introduces an amendment. And then if somebody offers an amendment and you want to amend their amendment, you can just write down what you want to change, hand it in, and you can vote on that. And it's actually kind of a compromise. You can go back and forth instead of being super hyper partisan on one side or the other. You can actually work across the aisle, compromise on stuff. And we did that. Winkler came forward with an amendment on ending the peacetime emergency. It was a horrible amendment, but we know the Democrats have the votes to add this to the bill. And it reinstated the governor's ability to write law for certain things, extended the time, and said that the governor can reissue his emergency at any time. It was unclear if he had to call the legislature back into session. It was ugly. And so I delayed by standing up and talking for a while Cal and Draz worked on writing the amendment to actually terminate that at a later date and be specific on clean up some of the language. And we worked together as a team, even with Kurt Dowd calling and getting hands on stuff. And it was great to see all the Republicans working together for the first time in months on the House floor to actually do good legislating and writing good amendments on the fly. And we actually got Hortman to take our amendment. So it was good. We worked as a team, and we actually wrote good legislation. And in the end, they had to come back and redo stuff and clean it up. And they ended up passing a clean ending the peacetime emergency resolution in that bill. So that was really good. So effectively today, the emergency has ended, and the governor has had to reholster his weapon of war against Minnesota businesses.
For the time being.
Yeah.
So I have to say, there's a couple things that are interesting to me over the course of the past 24 hours leading up to us recording this. One has been the proliferation of MNGOP talking points on the end of Governor Tim Walz's peacetime emergency, and framing it as, we finally did it. We ended the peacetime emergency. And so that's interesting for reasons that I think are obvious. But then what's also interesting to me is that Action for Liberty, that's been a recurring topic on our program, I expected, when I first started seeing like Mary Kiffmeyer, who's my state senator, her posts, and Roger Chamberlain's posts, and all these different senators posting about, and representatives as well, posting about how the Republicans have ended the peacetime emergency, the Senate has ended it, the House has ended it. I kind of expected a counterpunch from our friends along the lines of, how dare you take credit for this? That we've been trying to get you guys to pass the Never Again bill, whether we're talking about Mort's version, which they would be, or the version that you guys put forward as the new House Republican caucus. And there's some of that, you see that in some of the comment threads and whatnot, people bringing up the Never Again bills and hashtag Never Again and whatnot. But what's interesting to me is that the Action for Liberty, Jake Duesenberg, kind of jumped on the bandwagon a little bit and was like, yeah, we did it, folks. We've ended the peacetime emergency. Fantastic. I'm kind of interested in your take, offhand, anecdotal take of what it's been like to both have a reaction to this moment and to see the reactions coming from your colleagues and from activists and others.
Yeah, so on the House floor when we were debating this, as I was delaying so that Draz could write a new amendment, I kind of laid into the legislature about, informing a lot of especially the freshmen, about what the emergency powers are and how we are actually voting to end the emergency, but not actually ending the emergency powers. Because that's, we've talked about that before with the Never Again bill. The difference is when you vote to end the emergency, you're voting to end the peacetime emergency that was declared. And with it, the executive orders will sunset, will end. But it does not change the underlying chapter of law, Chapter 12, which gives the governor the authority to give himself emergency powers at any time for virtually any reason, because he's expanded his use of that language in the underlying chapter of law. So we have not ended the emergency powers. He still has it. And the best analogy I can think of is he has holstered his gun, but he still has a gun. We should be disarming the governor. And so, I talked about the Never Again bill on the House floor on how we need to change this chapter of law. And, perhaps we should look at Chapter 144 that we talked about in the last episode. But I've been correcting. In fact, Kurt Dowd tweeted, it's over. We've ended the emergency powers are done. And I retweeted it and said, actually, neither the House nor the Senate passed legislation actually preventing this from happening again. We haven't changed his emergency powers. The emergency has ended, but the threat continues. And that one got a lot of traction. A lot of people were reposting that in response to a lot of the establishment Republicans who were saying, we did it. It's done.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next thing. And
and that's the key part, is let's move on to the next thing. That definitely is the implication of the rhetoric that I'm seeing is, great, we did it, give us credit, and now let's move on and forget about it, when there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I know that Duesenberg and the Action for Liberty and the North Star Liberty Alliance people, it's one thing that I give them credit for is they have activated and engaged the base. I've been doing the same thing. I've been educating people on emergency powers too, but the Never Again movement, that language, that marketing of Never Again, to simplify it, they've been doing a very successful job of marketing that, so that you look at Gazelka's post and Kiffmeyer's post and Mark Horan's post, and there's 30 comments responding and saying it's not over until you change Chapter 12. Hashtag Never Again, so they are informed. And that is the most powerful thing, is having an informed voter. And you can't just, as a legislator, as a politician, just brush people aside and saying, we've solved the problem. Is there an opioid problem? Is there an opioid abuse problem? Oh, well, let's tax them. We're going to tax them and use the money to fight, heroin addiction. Like, no, you didn't solve the problem. It's still there. Just because you made it illegal. The hands-free bill. You might have said it's illegal or more illegal to drive while hands-free, but you didn't solve the distracted driving problem. You just wrote a law that nobody's going to follow. And so that we need to make sure that we've ended the emergency, but the governor hasn't followed what he should be restricted under Chapter 12. He hasn't followed that. And you see in California, they're already putting mask mandates on because of some variant of COVID that is still a threat, right? Seasonal influenza, we talked about this in the fall. If 2 kids die in the school from seasonal influenza, he could put a mask mandate on again. So
Right.
the emergency powers are still there. We have to address it.
So I know you've been dealing a lot with constituent engagement surrounding the less popularly discussed aspects of Governor Walz's executive emergency orders that he has given over the past 18 months. Specifically, I think of the moratorium on eviction and similar economic restrictions that have been put in under the auspices of the emergency with COVID. So all of that is done now. And what is the life of a constituent of yours? Well, yourself, you are a landlord. What does your life look like now as a landlord in terms of your ability to engage with your tenants and get your business back on the upside?
Well, I've learned there's a huge difference between the term landlord and property owner. So landlord makes me sound like some white privileged, tyrant. And property owner means that, hey, I own property that I rent out. So I'll call myself a property owner for the sake of this conversation. I've got many properties and several tenants that haven't paid rent on time, and some for several months. And I also have properties that are for sale, recently listed for sale. And so it's been difficult to sell a property, and a lot of constituents have the same problem. And so, yes, the emergency has ended. There's also a federal eviction moratorium that's still kind of in place. It may end today, but what Walz's agreement to negotiate ending his emergency was to give him a long off-ramp to the eviction moratorium. So his emergency powers have ended, but they have put in place laws, legislation, which is the proper way to do it, right? If we want to fix this problem, we have to legislate. So they have put in place legislation that allows the eviction moratorium to be, it prevents people from evicting someone so long as they continue to apply for federal or state assistance. So they can fill out an application, they can get denied, they can reapply, they can appeal it, all that kind of stuff. And it can last up to, I think, a year and so the problem tenants that are going to take advantage of the system could maintain, occupancy of a property and not pay rent for an additional year, which is, it's disgusting. But there's also, are there still some people that legitimately cannot find a job because they lost their job due to COVID? I think you're going to be hard pressed to find those individuals that, but unfortunately, that's what the negotiation was for the governor to give up his emergency. And then the second one was food stamps. That was a hard one too, where there are certain people who don't qualify for food stamps. And I'm going to go out on a limb and I think say that there may be undocumented immigrants, people here without permission, and some other small subsets of groups who didn't qualify normally for food stamps that Governor Walz got on food stamps. And then those would end if his emergency powers end. And so they negotiated some deal with the USDA to continue to supply food stamps for a very small subset of people. So those two things were continued.
Wow. Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, when you talk about, and I've been happily a homeowner for a number of years at this point, and so I haven't had to deal with the rental market for some time. And I know that prices have gone up and up and up. We in Albertville here, we just approved a new development where the rents are going to be on the top end $4,000 a month, which is incomprehensible to me. I don't know how you could possibly afford to pay that much for a rental, for a mortgage, let alone a rental. But let's just say your rent was $1,000 for whatever unit you have. Over the course of a year, that's $12,000. And, I'm not a great math guy, but, let's say you've got 10 apartment buildings, you got to times that by 10, $120,000 for a year of a property owner having a taking effectively. The government is taking that value directly out of their pocket. And there is little to no chance that they will ever be able to recoup it. That's criminal. I mean, when you think about, you take that and place it in any other context, I put a gun to your head and take $120,000 for you, I would be going to jail for the rest of my life properly. And yet that's what our government is doing to property owners here in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, it is the purest form of a taking. And, not every tenant is bad that's not paying rent. And not every property owner has every single tenant not paying. But it's frustrating that there's active campaigns being led by Democrats. I know Ilhan Omar was involved in one in Minneapolis, telling people not to pay rent and trying to do some big social justice warrior stuff. But this programs that they came out with using taxpayer dollars will pay all of the back rent and utilities for people who haven't paid. And that's one of the big things. If you've been struggling to pay your bills and if you've been struggling to pay your bills and you're behind, go ahead and shut it. If you've been struggling to pay your bills and have done so, but have done so at great consequence to everything else in your life, you don't get anything. It's only people who have not paid. It's kind of like the housing bailout during the housing crisis. They had programs available to get you caught up or to do short sales if you didn't pay your mortgage. But if you made all the sacrifices to get your mortgage paid, you didn't get anything. So it penalizes people who aren't trying to do the right things and rewards bad behavior, basically.
Wow. Yeah, it's disappointing to hear that. I was a little excited at the prospect of all of the. So that being the case, it kind of raises an interesting question. What are we celebrating, right? Because the mask mandate was lifted. We've all the day-to-day lives of most Minnesotans have reestablished a certain degree of normalcy. So what tangible effect does the end of the emergency declaration by Governor Walz have on the average Minnesotan? What's life going to be like tomorrow that it couldn't be like today?
Nothing really changes. The threat is still there. What really changes is that Governor Walz can go out and campaign in rural Minnesota and say, "Oh, there is no emergency powers anymore; those are gone." And that's right. It's unfortunate that people will maybe soon forget how painful it was, and that we're going to have to remind them what these lockdowns were like. But it's opened up the ability for Walz to go out and campaign. And I hope that Republicans don't forget this, and that Republicans continue to push for Chapter 12 changes so we can actually amend his emergency powers, restrict him for future lockdowns, and that kind of thing. So, as we get to the end of session here, or did you have anything else on that one to wrap up?
Well, I was just going to say that we've talked before about what's going to be required to transition from the COVID-specific rhetoric and campaign planks to a more general and universal statement of principle. And I hope that the 2022 and further election cycles, that the Republican narrative will become a narrative of empowering people, empowering residents and voters and citizens to retake and reclaim the power that is currently highly centralized, and addressing Chapter 12 and addressing the governor's capacity to take this gun out of his holster and point it at us all once again is part of that. I don't know whether on its own it's going to last the test of time as something that motivates people, even as proximate as next year, to come out and vote one way or the other. But making it a part of the conversation that falls under the umbrella of a larger populist reform, where we're saying government in Minnesota needs to function differently than it does today, because right now it's a very small cabal of people who get to decide what public policy is going to look like in this state. And there's only an illusion, there's only this theatrical dressing to kind of allay, to kind of make you feel like you have input, when in point of fact, they couldn't care less what you think. If that's the message, then the specifics of executive powers in Chapter 12 and the statutes and what have you, the weeds, as we call them, won't matter as much.
Yeah. Well, I was asked on I have a weekly radio show that I do for 35 minutes on several markets in southern Minnesota. And the radio host is Al Travis. He's a good conservative. And he asked me today, so let's fast forward to the campaign season. What are the two issues that Republicans are going to campaign on? And what are the two issues that Democrats are going to campaign on? And I'm like, well, I said, I hate to say it, but Republicans are not good at marketing, right? We don't know how to sell freedom and liberty. We don't know how to package that up, because Democrats' solution is what government is going to do for you. And
Right.
Republicans need to somehow say, we want you to do whatever you want to do for yourself and not take from you. And it's hard to explain that to people. It's hard to give people that issue and versus what Democrats do, just promise you everything and then end up delivering half of that. And, Republicans end up just negotiating away all of our freedom. I don't understand how we can figure out what to campaign on. And they said, what are Democrats in a campaign on? I'm like, the same hate, racism, division, identity politics that they've been doing. And for some reason, and I still can't get over this, how Democrats have won on healthcare. That they were the party of Obamacare, which has completely eviscerated the private market in rural Minnesota, and yet they campaigned on healthcare and won. I don't understand how they could do that. But somehow they're going to basically just campaign on the same issues. They're going to somehow spin the defund the police movement. We should be running on funding our police, and they're going to turn it around on us and say, and I've already started to see the rhetoric. Oh, Jim Hagedorn voted against the blah, 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 omnibus, enormous bailout package that funded local cities. And so he defunded the police. Like, they're going to turn that around on us somehow and win by saying that we defunded the police. I won't be surprised if that's how it turns out.
Yeah, I wish I could say with any amount of confidence that that's too absurd a strategy to work, but I don't know if there's such a thing as too absurd a political strategy to work. If it's coming from the Democrats in the state of Minnesota, given all of their structural and institutional advantages, ironically.
Well, if you had a candidate that let's just say you were going to run in, let's get closer, Maple Grove. Let's say you were going to run in Maple Grove, a second ring suburb of Minneapolis. What would you campaign on for state senate or state house?
Off the top of my head, the two things I would campaign on are law and order, criminal justice. I would campaign hard on 1990 style criminal justice reform. I would go 180 degrees the opposite of what the Democrats are doing on that. I would say, okay, because what you want to do in an election is you want to draw distinctions, right? So therefore, being completely lenient, letting people block the freeway, letting people burn down cities. I'm for the opposite of all of that. I'm for throwing all those people in jail and throwing away the key. I'm for putting more cops on the street. I'm for treating our law enforcement with honor and respect, and bringing back Mayberry, USA. That's what I'm for. That would be one thing. And another thing I think I would go for is because that's kind of the reactionary and traditional issue, criminal justice, law and order. I think you couple that with something that is unconventional and that creates a narrative and that drives the conversation forward. So school choice, talk about education. And in talking about education, you could weave it into this CRT stuff. I see something very fascinating going on around the conversation on critical race theory. That it's what fascinates me is that this has been a fringe issue that very few people for a long time truly understood or knew anything about. You brought up CRT and you have to spend 15 minutes explaining what it was. And now, I went less than a month ago to a school board meeting in St. Francis where I watched a dozen or more people, random people, get up and give barn burner speeches that were well researched. Like, they obviously knew what they were talking about in opposition to critical race theory. And parallel to that, we've seen YouTube video after viral video after tweet where there have been other school board meetings around the nation where people have been speaking out against CRT. So something's happening there, but I don't think being anti-CRT can be made into a campaign issue. But what you can do is you could talk about the quality of education. You could talk about the importance of getting high performance and fulfilling student potential in our education process. And in talking about that, you have to confront the equity question, which undermines that. Like, we can't have both of these things. We can't both say that everybody's going to have equal outcomes and that we're going to fulfill the potential of the individual student who has individual needs. One of these things has to be dispensed with, and the one that I'm saying we should dispense with is equity.
How would you, Walter, talk about election integrity? I was talking with a former state senator the other day who went to a local election integrity meeting that I think the Republican Party is setting up. And he went there and he thought it was the biggest joke. There were a lot of people that were mad, that wanted answers, that wanted, information. And the people running it were, it was just like super hyper partisan, making jokes about Democrats stealing elections, and really fostering the narrative that I hate hearing about, which is the big lie that everything is fraud, and we're not actually addressing real legislation that can restore integrity of the elections. We know there's a certain amount of fraud, but there's also just bad counting. There's a ton of people that are voting that shouldn't be, whether it's through people that are disqualified or their residency is different, legitimate stuff that we should be working on and cleaning up and helping people to have an intelligent conversation about election integrity. I mentioned this before. If you can talk about it for 30 minutes and not say fraud or stolen, you've arrived at some place where you can have an intelligent conversation with the other side. But how does a candidate go out and talk about what they want to do without just being attacked from the other side? Like in the vaccine debate, when you talk about vaccines and you get called an anti-vaxxer, what's your advice to somebody running to talk about elections?
Well, I don't know if I can roll with that premise that your objective ought to be to not get attacked and called names, because you're gonna. Like, if you address it, let's just be honest, election integrity is a threat to Democrats. It is. Now, you can infer from that what you will about their motives, what they do, what they don't do. But it is obviously a fact. You just look at how hard they campaign against it, how hard they come after anybody who brings up the issue. It's obviously a threat to them. And so they're going to respond to that threat by calling you, by doing what they always do, by calling you names, by impugning your character, by calling you a racist, all of these things. So I don't think that there's a way to address the issue that's going to get everybody in the room to nod and smile and think you're a wonderful person. What I think you need to do is approach it from a couple of levels. One is kind of the respectable conversation, and the other is hardcore aggressive rhetoric. On the hardcore aggressive rhetoric side, I think you attack the Democrats for their racism, because their opposition to election integrity is racist. It is. Their premise is that because I'm Black, I'm less likely to be able to get a driver's license or a state ID card. Are you kidding me? I'm less able to engage in a basic human function because of the color of my skin? Screw you. And that needs to be the statement. That needs to be the argument. It needs to be put in those terms. This is a deeply racist and offensive position that the DFL has officially taken and that Democrats have officially taken, that Black people are too dumb to get a state ID. So that needs to be highlighted, and they need to be put on the defensive of having to defend why that's their position, because it clearly is, and they're on the record saying it.
If you look at Georgia, for instance, Georgia implemented voter ID and during this last election, and they had the highest voter turnout ever. So you can look to actual data to show, hey, guess what? Voter ID does not disenfranchise Democrats. It just restores some election integrity, which restores people's faith in government. We need to have that conversation. And there's a lot of conservative groups that went out and filmed on liberal campuses. What do you think about voter ID? all these white privileged college students, oh, black people can't afford IDs and they don't have internet. And then they go on the street of, Brooklyn and they say, or Harlem, and they ask all these black people, what do you think about, do you have a driver's license? Well, hell, of course I need one. Do you have internet? On my phone and at home, So they debunk a lot of those myths, and they cast it in a pretty racist light when Democrats say that black people can't afford to get driver's licenses and such.
Yeah, and I think you need to put them on the defensive and make them answer for that, because those are horrendous claims with horrendous implications that they need to be held accountable for. So you put them on the defensive, and then you come at them with the affirmative argument for why we ought to have election integrity, which goes something like this. And I'm going to try to respect your condition of not bringing up fraud or stealing. The reason why I lock my door at night in Albertville, Minnesota, which is not a high crime area, the likelihood of my household being victimized tonight is infinitesimally small. It's astronomically small. There's virtually no likelihood of us being victimized as a family. We've been living here for 5 years in this house. Hasn't happened. Everywhere I've lived in other locations, I've never been broken into. I've never had somebody come to my house unlawfully and assault me or my family. It's never happened. But I'm going to lock my door tonight. Why? Because there is a minimal amount of effort that has to go into doing it. And the benefit for that minimal amount of effort is peace of mind, confidence, the ability to sleep at night, knowing that I have taken the most basic of steps to secure my family and to secure my property. The same thing applies to our election system. The fact that we're even having this debate is the argument for election integrity. It should be beyond the capacity of anybody. There should be no doubt in anybody's mind. It should be absurd to even consider the possibility that there could be something wrong with our electoral results. It is the year 2021. We are 6 years past the point where we're supposed to have flying cars and hoverboards. And you're telling me that we can't nail down with 100% accuracy who voted, how many ballots there were, and match those numbers up and be right 100% of the time? How do we not have this ability? How does it take longer to count ballots in 2020 than it did in 1920? Can you explain that to me? How is it that it takes longer to determine who the president of the United States is this century than it did last century? This is indicative of a problem. And what we need to do is we need to nail down that problem. We need to install some locks. We need to install an alarm system, put up some cameras. We need to establish basic, minimal effort, minimally invasive measures to provide us with peace of mind. That's all we need to do. And voter ID is part of that. So some other checks and balances to ensure that the system is above board, that it's transparent, that anybody who asks for information that we ought to have publicly can get it promptly and accurately, and that there's no question as to its authenticity. These are not huge asks. These are minimum asks. This is like the bare minimum of what we should be able to expect as citizens in Minnesota. So I think that's the case that we ultimately should be making.
Yeah, no, I think you have a really good analogy when you're talking about securing your house and comparing that to the elections, because that's absolutely right. I used to work in IT security, and it was the same thing with threats, mitigating threats, and identifying, in talking about like the screen door, even though you have those threats, the threat may exist outside, but you need to do things to prevent that, prevent intrusion. And so, that great analogy, and I think I'm going to steal that one from you when I'm out talking about election integrity, because I think people can relate to that and understand why would you do something when there's no documented, proof of fraud, and you're like, there doesn't have to be, because you're talking about restoring integrity and people's faith in the elections. And why don't you do this to prove that there isn't fraud? I mean, some of the things that we have in Minnesota in law, people ask me all the time, they call me and say, we need to audit our elections. I say, we can't really audit, because if we're auditing, we're looking at the number in, the number counted. you need to find out who's voting that shouldn't be. And there is stuff that we're not recording because there isn't a law that requires we do. And so you're not able to track it. So we don't even know if there's fraud out there, how much it is. I mean, we know there's fraud. Secretary of State Steve Simon admitted there's fraud in every election to a certain small degree, but he didn't know how much. And I've talked a lot about the ballot harvesting that goes on. We have a law against ballot harvesting. It says that every voter can bring up to 3 ballots for other voters and bring them in during an entire election season. And when you do, you have to fill out an affidavit saying you had permission so that they know Walter Hudson delivered a ballot in Minneapolis and 2 in St. Michael. And you're maxed out now. But then they also have a law that says you can have ballot drop boxes outside of an election office. Guess what? Walter Hudson can drop 100 in the drop boxes. So how do we have a law in the books to prevent ballot harvesting by saying he has to fill out affidavits when there's unmanned ballot drop boxes? So we need to clean up our election laws so that we can root out fraud. Because when I talk about ballot harvesting, people say, well, there's already a law against that. We track them. Well, yeah, but there's also a law that says there's a ballot drop box. So how do you have these in conflict? So there's a lot of work we can do on election integrity, and I think that is one of the planks that we should be talking about during the next election. Although you're only going to really get conservatives who vote for that because Democrats have just bought in fully into this, the idea that there's this big lie being pushed on the American public.
Maybe, but I think there is an opportunity to change the narrative by changing the way that we talk about it. And this analogy, which you please steal it all you want, use it as much as you can, wide and far. I think it works on a variety of levels because it undermines virtually every talking point that they have. Because what's the first thing they say when you talk about election integrity is, well, there's no evidence of fraud. Okay, well, there's no evidence that anybody's going to come to my house tonight and assault me and my wife and my kids. No evidence. I have no reason to believe that. In addition, the unwillingness to set up surveillance cameras, the unwillingness to have an alarm system, the unwillingness to lock your door is going to leave you in a position where you're not going to have a whole lot of evidence of anything happening, whether it does or not. So the question of whether or not there's evidence is begging the question of whether or not we're looking for evidence or whether or not evidence is even detectable. To your point, an audit is pointless because you're auditing tainted evidence, right? You're auditing ballots that have already been counted, but you don't know where they came from. So that's not going to tell you anything. You need to address things on the front end. You need to have that system in place to provide you with the means to have evidence as to whether or not something happened or not. And I think the other way that we change the narrative on this is instead of focusing on fraud, stolen, we say, listen, what the way to sell to Democrats is you want to shut people up about stolen elections, make it impossible for them to make their case.
Yes, that is exactly what we should be doing. And one of the things I talk about too, I had an election judge call me when I was driving to St. Paul at 6:30 or something in the morning. And, they were going through all these motions about how they have served as an election judge for so many years or decades. And now when they go to be an election judge, when they go there on election day to be an election judge, over half the ballots were already cast in the 45 days beforehand. And he said, I'm not there to watch those people come in and vote. And so when they're open for 45 days, 8 hours a day, doing early voting, there's no election judges there watching. And so you're missing an important part, in these small communities where an election judge knows everybody or a lot of people. And so I think that is a big missing part too, when we say, well, we have election judges there that would be able to judge it. Well, they're not there for most of the election, especially if we do them by mail. And they remove the witness signature and everything else. So, and then we should also have provisional balloting. If you go to register in Minnesota on election day or within 2 weeks of election, they don't check to make sure that your, social security number matches what's in the federal registry. They do that after the fact. But without provisional balloting, if you're not a registered voter and you vote, your vote is counted. They don't set you aside until they can verify, which is what they do in most other states. So, having the loosey-goosey restrictions we have on registering same day or using a cable bill or somebody vouching for you, and on top of that, not having provisional voting, we don't know who's voting. And that's what I tell a lot of people asking me for an audit is we have the loosest restrictions on voting. So there's virtually no way we can catch and root out fraud unless we put things in place, like what you're talking in your analogy.
I think another way that you can engage in a little bit of rhetorical jujitsu and turn the left's talking point against them is, their big thing is talking about how we need to count every vote and everybody deserves to vote and everybody should have access to the voting booth and the ballot and what have you. But what is access? Like if I deserve to have a vote, which is your case, DFL, if I deserve to have a vote, don't I deserve to know that it wasn't countermanded? Don't I deserve the confidence that my vote counted as a full vote and that it wasn't diluted by somebody who's playing the system? Like, you can't have it both ways. You can't tell me that on the one hand, I deserve a vote and everybody deserves a vote and we should make voting as widely available for everyone as humanly possible. And also, don't worry about whether or not that vote meant anything. Don't worry about whether or not it got canceled out by somebody else who's not playing by the rules. Yeah, it's either one or the other. And if everybody's vote matters, which I think it does, then we ought to take simple, basic, lock the door steps to ensure that it actually counts.
Yeah, here's another example I used with Democrats, and I call this is also political jujitsu. When Democrats remember when they were shouting Russia, 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 mess with our elections and, Facebook and junk. And I say, hey, do you want to get these foreign, nations out of meddling with our elections? We want to, restore American election integrity. Yeah. Well, then we should prevent foreigners from messing with our election. So if you are a citizen of another country, you shouldn't be allowed to vote in our country. Yeah. And it's like, and so you turn that into, well, that's, I work with a bunch of Indians in the IT industry, and they voted in the 2016 election. A whole room full of them were like, oh yeah, we just used our cable bill and we got to vote and took selfies with our ballot voting for Hillary Clinton. And I'm like, you can't do that. And they're like, we asked, what do we need? And she said cable bill. So we voted. You're a citizen of India. You're not, you're a lawful resident, but you're not a citizen of this country. And we need to prevent foreign, interference in our elections. And so turning that around on Democrats when they shout Russia, talk about, not illegal immigrants. I mean, they can vote, they vote too, unfortunately, but lawful residents, people that have been here years or even a decade, if they're not a citizen, they don't get to vote. And they also vote in their home elections. And so they're voting twice.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and I've thought about that irony as well. And there needs to be far more Republican rhetorical jujitsu along the lines of what we're talking about, where we take because their points are always contradictory. Where we take their points and we point out the contradictions and we offer to them in such a way that they don't have a comeback. Because you say that to a Democrat, you offer it in that way. What's their response possibly going to be? Oh no, it's actually okay for there to be foreign influence as long as it's, this guy over here as opposed to that guy over there. You put them in a position where they have to reveal their hypocrisy. And when you and I do it on a podcast or, on the floor of the Minnesota State House, it has limited effectiveness. But if more Republicans across the board at all levels were engaged in that sort of rhetorical combat, it could be quite effective.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Walter, it's been a great conversation for this episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane, including elections and campaigning and election integrity issues. So I hope we can continue this weekly conversation now that we're ending our special session and getting out of the thick of legislating and maybe turning into maybe following some of the campaigns. Maybe we could have some of the candidates running for governor on the show. I had a good conversation with Mike Marty. That's Mike Marty from Rochester.
Sure.
And maybe we could have him on the show too and talk about how his campaign is going. I think he's been on, one of the mics has been on Newsmax a couple times. So we could get them on the show and talk about issues and maybe follow some of the other candidates for Attorney General and Secretary of State and state auditor and everything. So,
Yeah, that's got to be the first question: is how sick are you of being called one of the mics?
yeah, right. That's very good. All right. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and thanks everybody for following along. You can go to jeremymunson.com/podcast to get a link to all of the episodes to download the show if you're just watching it on Facebook or YouTube. Or you can find us on Pandora or everywhere you download your podcast. We're out on 20 different sites.